You're listening in on an animated discussion about the new Batman adventures with two experts in their fields. I'm Joshua Unruh, superhero scholar.
And I'm Caleb Masters, your friendly neighborhood film critic extraordinaire from thecinemetropolis.com. And today's topic is Legends of the Dark Knight. So, Joshua, I think I heard some rumors about Batman, and I hear he's sort of brooding, and at one point was a sparkly vampire. I had my uncle who once encountered the sparkling vampire version of him. I don't know if you've heard that story. But they transformed him from sparkly vampire into the Batman. How does that work?
I think that's one of the less weird options that we've seen in Batman permutations. Honestly, sparkly vampire Batman is just as reasonable as, Batman goes up against Jack the Ripper, or Batman goes back to his Scottish roots or whatever. And we've had all of that stuff. So yeah, nice. It's interesting to me that you went for sparkly vampire instead of the actual kind of vampire that we get in this episode.
Well, no, see, Joshua, I was going for the sparkly vampire because the next Batman is played by Robert Pattinson.
Oh, you're right. You're right. You know what? Shame on me for not immediately making that connection, because here's my controversial opinion. Pattinson's perfect. And the only reason that I'm not more excited about that movie is that as soon as they said Pattinson, I was like, do Batman and Son, you cowards. Where's my Damian Wayne casting?
Hey, man, they gotta save it for the sequels. I'm actually pretty ecstatic about the direction of that new Batman movie because Matt Reeves is a terrific director. That's another podcast. But yes, Robert Pattinson, A+ choice. And hey, I bet, Joshua, that Robert Pattinson's Batman is going to be a lot different than Ben Affleck's Batman, which is a lot different than Christian Bale's Batman, which is definitely different than George Clooney's Batman. But you know what? They're all still Batman.
Yeah, more or less. And I think that's the beauty of this episode, right? That is what this episode is doing. It's getting a little meta, and it's telling us that all of these interpretations of Batman are more or less equally valid. Whatever you prefer from your Batman, you can have it. It's been 100 years or nearly enough with so many different takes. Just have the Batman you want it to be. And the other thing that I found really interesting about the title of this, it's a little comic book thing that you are probably not aware of, is that there was a long-running comic book series called Legends of the Dark Knight, and it was mostly used to tell stories of Batman's earlier career. Not so early that you're in the kind of year 1 or year 2 area, usually, but, he's always perpetually 10 years into his war on crime, except for the New 52, where he was perpetually 5 years into his war on crime. But the less said about the New 52, the better. And it's fascinating to me that even the people that created the New 52 now agree with me. But so Legends of the Dark Knight runs for dozens of issues, just telling these stories that kind of fill in the gap that is between Batman the novice and Batman the consummate professional. Whereas on this show, we use that title to explore entirely different fictional facets of Batman within one of the facets of Batman that has since become one of the biggest cultural touchstones for the character. It is meta and fantastic, and I really, really, really like it. And that meta-textualness even goes into some of the designs. Because let me ask you, Caleb, did you recognize some of our children?
Oh, yes, Joshua. It is very clear that they are supposed to be inspired by Bruce Timm, Paul Dini, not sure about the girl, and then Joel Schumacher. So I definitely picked up on looking like childlike versions of our favorite Batman the Animated Series writers.
Yeah, absolutely. And Carrie Kelly, well, I don't know if they ever give her last name, but that's definitely supposed to be Carrie Kelly, who is the Robin in Dark Knight Returns. And her look is just very, very distinct. And I think you can actually see that when they have her standing next to their other childlike versions, because she still kind of looks like a Frank Miller drawing, right? Even standing next to them, because they knew she was going to have to work in that space. But yeah, we get some meta-ness even in there, because we've got Paul Dini telling a very Silver Agey Dick Sprang style take on Batman. You've got Bruce Timm doing the kind of man-bat, vampire Batman thing. And then, of course, Joel Schumacher, who just really likes rubber suits and cars that drive up walls. And hey, Joel, you know, buddy, I was not fair to you when I was a teen. I owe you an apology, sir. I take it all back. Great job.
He knew what he was doing, and it was lots of fun.
He knew what he was doing, and he meant to do it, and by God, he did it. And let's talk about some of that, huh? Let's just run through it in order, I guess, like in chronological order. So that first story that's told, we hear about a sort of man-bat / they never say vampire, but he's very vampire-ish.
Yes.
Yeah. And I will mention that might be homaging a story that was kind of popular at the time. It was popular enough that it got a follow-up. DC does these things called Elseworlds. They're sort of like Marvel's What If, except instead of going for one issue, they usually go for a bigger prestige length story. And so you'll get things like, what if Batman were in the Old West during the Civil War? Or what if he fought Jack the Ripper? Or what if Superman landed in the USSR instead of Kansas? You know, you get these kind of big what if stories. And they actually did a story where Batman fought Dracula and won, but in the process, he was infected with vampirism and continues to operate as the Batman, perhaps more effectively and more frighteningly, but also is, you know, staving off his bloodlust constantly. I think it's a reference to that without really going super hard for it in anything other than the look.
No, I definitely think this is an aesthetic choice, but I do really like it because there's this question that bookends the episode. Is he a man? Is he a beast? What is he? And I like that they plant the seed of he's a man bat. He sucks the blood of victims. You know, I think the exact scripts read something like he's a giant pterodactyl beast with big fangs and talons. I think that's a lot of fun because it's really, you know, if Batman were a real character, a real crime fighter that children heard about, I'd imagine those would be the kinds of stories they'd hear, right? Like, oh, we don't even know if he's a man. He's got talons and fangs. And I just thought the way they realized that visually while sort of maintaining that like preteen level of imagination of a man bat to be pretty clever.
Yeah, without going too far down this rabbit trail, this is a thought that I've had a lot because we'll talk more about why when we get to the Dark Knight Returns homage, but Batman Year One used to be like my number one favorite story, and I've since moved away from it some. But between Batman Year One and, like I say, that kind of like more mature Batman take that you usually get where he's been at it for 10 years, I've often had this thought of like, when did people stop being afraid of a man-shaped bat monster and start being afraid of Batman because he will catch you no matter what, you know? And so going back to a space where I think the world at large doesn't necessarily, they probably think he has superpowers, but they don't think that Batman's a literal monster. But we have these kids floating around who are a little more impressionable, and we get to kind of look at a monster version of Batman through that lens. And to me, one of the more fascinating parts of that in terms of this episode is they still love him. You know, how often has I gone on about kids love Batman in this show? And even when he's a monster, they're still like, dope as heck though, man. I want that, you know?
Well, Joshua, I just think especially these kids seem like they're edging up against that like preteen age. I mean, it's kind of vague, but I feel like you're at the point where scary stuff is kind of cool, right? You're like, oh, the mystery, the scares, like all of it. It really kind of, in my mind, is like how kids would imagine Batman based just off of the rumors you hear on the playground or something like that. They say he's not even human, or you know, things like that. I thought that was a very clever take and such a stark contrast from what we get in the next two vignettes.
Absolutely. It's really, we kind of get these, the supernatural take, right, is more what this is without ever coming right out and saying it. And it is interesting to me that as cool a visual as that is, we don't really get like a whole story for it. You know, we just get kind of like a vague gesture towards what might be going on with Monster Batman, because I do think it's an interesting take, but I don't know that it's a take that can carry its weight for very long. That said, there was Blood Rain in its sequel, but that was it. Kind of ran its course after that point.
Well, Joshua, I imagine your favorite vignette, though, was the second one, which is the one that I think is much more. Would it be Golden Age or Silver Age Batman? The kind of classic, silly, fun, goofy, but also very stylized Batman?
Yeah, you're definitely like in the very late Golden Age shifting into the Silver Age. And the reason I say that it's a little bit of a liminal space is that you can see that this style is the Dick Sprang era. Dick Sprang was an artist. He was very much responsible for like the look of Batman, and the idea of all of this like giant props floating around was very much a Dick Sprang thing. Now, that's not from nowhere. At the time, you would see those kinds of things like on billboards and stuff, giant typewriters and things. But then, of course, Gotham just turns it up to 11. And so, yeah, that's the Dick Sprang era. And the reason I say it's a little bit of a liminal space between Golden and Silver Age is that when you get further into the Silver Age, you have to stop fighting crime because of the Comics Code Authority and McCarthyism and the House Un-American Activities Committee and a whole bunch of other stuff. Check out my Superhero University podcast on Batman for more of that history. But he has to stop fighting crime. Batman has to stop fighting crime and instead becomes kind of a swashbuckling Flash Gordon sci-fi guy. But before that happens, you have this space where they're trying to be more kid-friendly, like on purpose, on the label. Let's be a little goofier. Let's be a little more broad. But we're still, stopping arch villains from stealing Pagliacci's original sheet music or something. So, yeah, it's fantastic.
The gimmick here was incredible, by the way. Yeah, like the music museum with the tubas, like all the giant instruments. This felt like iconic, workman-like Batman from like you would. Am I pop your imagination and thinking like, what is that, Joshua, the 50s or the 60s Batman?
Yeah, we'd be like late 50s edging into the 60s. And the reason I can say that is, when we get into the 60s, Dick Sprang and Carmine Infantino kind of started sharing the art chores between Batman books. And Carmine Infantino, I bring up specifically because the books he was drawing became very much the foundation for the look of Batman 66. So once you get to the mid 60s, we're pretty thoroughly shifted away from Dick Sprang in the comics, but then you start to see more of that style in a way in the Batman 66 show. But because Dick Sprang's art is so stylized, it's like you pick the parts that you can do in live action in 1966 and you let the rest go,
Right. It just has that like the larger than life, sort of styling, and even the dialogue writing here. The Joker makes a pun. I'll have to make a note for that.
I know,
right? Or when Batman says, "Well done, old chum." It was so, I don't know. I had a big grin on my face watching this whole thing play out, especially with the gimmick of the piano keys being the thing that were threatening Batman and Robin. That's just, it feels iconic. It really does.
I love it. I love that. I really love that stuff. And I'm going to tip a little bit of my hand here and say, no one who knows me should be surprised that, yeah, you're absolutely right. This is my favorite vignette on here. And partly that's because the rest of the competition just isn't that strong, in my opinion. And like I say, we're going to get to the Dark Knight Returns stuff, but the competition isn't that strong. But also, I feel like I can draw a straight line from this vignette through to my personal favorite Batman cartoon, and the one that I would argue is the best Batman cartoon, Batman the Brave and the Bold. Like, it's a straight line.
Oh, yeah.
Between this and that. And man, yeah, I love that stuff. And the fact that it lets me kind of trot out some of my Batman historian bona fides is also a bit of a joy. I won't lie. I like knowing that stuff, and I like when I get to tell other people about that stuff. Plus, who doesn't like saying Dick Sprang? I'm just going to leave that there.
Dick Sprang. Hey, also, the voice cast here, different voices for every vignette. The Joker in this one was voiced by Michael McKean, who is fantastic. I heard the voice. I was like, wait, that isn't Looks Up Online. Nope, totally is. They had Gary Owen as Batman. It's just, again, really clever casting with the voices, and I think that's something that continues into the third and final vignette we get.
Yeah. Now, I want to talk just briefly, because we brought him up, about Joel, air quotes, Shoemaker.
Yes.
Because we don't get a whole vignette for him, but it's really interesting to me that these guys felt the need, these creators felt the need to include a mention or a nod or, a touch point with the Batman movies that were in the theater at the time, being created by Joel Schumacher. And without doing a huge history lesson here, for those of you who haven't seen those movies, they were very much in tension with the first two Burton movies.
Yes.
They were, honestly, here's the okay, controversial statement. I can't believe that there are still people who with a straight face claim that those Tim Burton movies are dark. Okay, they are technically dark. They are actually darker.
They are more gothic would probably be the better word for it. I mean, they are dark in the sense that they're gothic. Like there are
the lights are literally turned off.
Right, like
a lot
the
of the
style
time,
is dark, and some of the themes are very, again, Bram Stoker's Dracula, melodramatic. Like, so it's dark in that way at times, but I mean, it's not like dark, gritty, and especially when we think about dark and gritty in 2021, like those things are nothing.
I mean, let's remember one of those two have an army of penguins with rockets on their backs.
Oh, yes.
Okay, so I don't care how hideous and gross you make Danny DeVito's penguin. I don't care how kind of sort of tragic you make his backstory. You had an army of penguins with rockets on their back. Like, please stop pretending like Burton's approach is some wild divergence from Batman 66, because gang, it ain't.
No, it's a beautiful crossroads between Batman 66 and Tim Burton being Tim Burton. That's what it is. It's great.
Yeah. And then when they bring Joel Schumacher in, he just goes even harder for the Batman 66 stuff. Like a lot more neon, just a lot more giant over the top. Batman is kind of scary, but mostly he's just a really cool, competent guy. So it's really interesting to me that these creators felt like they needed to speak to those movies that were going on, while also kind of downplaying them a little bit. And I'll just be honest with you, I know why I didn't like them at the time. There were two reasons, and both of them were tied up in the fact that I was a teenage boy. One of them was I was still deep in my desire and need for Batman to be taken seriously, which is fascinating to me now because I grew out of that like you're supposed to, and Warner Brothers never has, and that's hilarious to me. The other thing I feel like I rebelled against, even though I wouldn't have been able to put it into words, is that I rebelled against the queerness of Joel Schumacher's take on Batman. I really did. I loved the neon and I loved some of the over-the-top stuff, but I was off-put by the rubber outfits, and I was off-put by the close-up of male behinds in latex outfits and things like that. Again, at the time, I couldn't have articulated that, and I now obviously repent of these feelings and love Schumacher's high camp approach to Batman. I really do. I've found a new appreciation for it. But it's just interesting to me that in the thick of that, these guys respected Joel Schumacher enough that they felt like they had to put a version of him in the show to represent what was in the theaters right then. But then they also kind of poo-poo it, like in the same breath.
Yeah, I think that I imagine these creators had very complex feelings about their relationship to the movies, especially. Now, I did check this episode aired about a year and a half after Batman and Robin had come out. So Batman and Robin had already come out, had already been critically panned, and I think the public or mainstream audiences had already decided they didn't like it at the time. But you're right, they did include him, but it's like we're including him because obviously he marks an important part of the Batman history, while simultaneously, like, we weren't a fan. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's kind of the gist I got of it.
Yeah. It's Yeah, I don't know. I'd be really interested to honestly hear from those creators that they wanted to respect him while also disrespecting him. I digress. I just felt like we needed to touch on Joel on the way, both as kind of a historical context, but honestly, we've probably spent more time than we should have because technically there is no Joel Schumacher vignette. There's just a version of Joel Schumacher advocating for it.
Well, it's more interesting than the final vignette, in my opinion. So that's which is the Dark Knight Returns vignette, which is Batman versus the mutants. Which Dark Knight Returns, of course, and I'm sure you're going to speak to this, is one of the most popular Batman comics.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Most well known. And it's by Frank Miller. So the inclusion here totally makes sense. And at the time, I mean, we didn't have Batman like we have everywhere now. So I'm sure seeing that on the screen was a pretty big deal, especially for fans of that specific comic. Josh, do you have some historical context there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. That at the time would have been electrifying. And I mean, it was to me, thanks to Batman Year One, honestly, more Batman Year One than Dark Knight Returns, but thanks to both of those, I kind of became a Frank Miller fan. I drifted from there into his Sin City work and really enjoyed that. And of course, Ronin at the time was being done for DC. It was very much like we couldn't get Lone Wolf and Cub comic books or manga here, and the movies were extremely hard to come by at the time. But by God, Frank Miller was going to homage that and do this cyberpunk samurai story in Ronin. He was doing a lot of really interesting work. And of course, he comes off of Daredevil, where he just really gritted Daredevil up and turned it into a very noir story. And so this would have been 10 or 11 years, something like that, after The Dark Knight Returns was originally published. So it would have been very much still the hottest thing in the world, having gotten a big resurgence thanks to Batman 89. Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns are largely credited with creating the trade paperback market for bookstores because people were hearing about Watchmen and came to the bookstore to buy it and they didn't have it. And then when 89, Tim Burton's first movie took off, just Batman comics became a thing people actually cared about. And Dark Knight Returns was, pretending to be for grownups. So it was very on point and topical. And this would have been, like I say, only 10 or 11 years after the initial publication and only a handful of years after that resurgence from 89. However, hey, wait. You've read Dark Knight Returns, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I have it on my shelf. I've read it like 3 or 4 times.
So, Caleb, before I talk a little bit about where I'm at with Frank Miller and Dark Knight Returns now, and what I feel is like really important that I mention to our listeners who may not be comic book people, before I do that, let me take a step back and say, tell me how you feel about Dark Knight Returns.
I mean, I really like it. It's on my shelf. It's one of like a handful of comic books I own. I think it's a strong one-shot. So here's the thing about it, though. As I've learned with a lot of my fandoms, I feel like I have a pretty healthy relationship with it, which is I think it's a fun read. I think there are certain aspects about how he portrays Batman that are a lot of fun. There's also a lot of things he portrays about Batman in that comic that I find pretty detestable. That said, I really like the idea of what if Batman retires and settles down, and then suddenly the day the Joker wakes up or something is that or as soon as Batman reactivates to fight the mutants, the Joker wakes up, and like that whole idea of Batman as an old man cowling back up one more time and sort of reactivating Gotham City in a way. I think that's all really fun. I think it's a good read. So I really, really like it from that perspective. That said, there's also a ton of things I don't like about how he portrays Batman. Also, I have decided I don't really like Frank Miller as a creator. Also, the biggest lesson I've learned about fandoms in the last, say, 5 years is that we all like things for different reasons. And unfortunately, the things I pick up on is like, oh, this is clearly a thing that's probably not good. Or, Batman just totally murdering people. Not a fan of that. Some people took the opposite lesson from it, where they're like, "Oh no, that's super cool," and I'm like, "Oh, I don't know if I don't think that's what the lesson you're supposed to take from that." But okay. So I say that to say I appreciate it. I also don't like it in the way a lot of people tend to, and like put it up as this like sacred book alongside like Watchmen and Year One. all of 3 of those, of which I like, but is like some sort of sacred text for Batman. I'm like, I mean, it's just another Batman story that has its own problems. It's problematic, much like Frank Miller as a creator. How about you, Joshua?
Speaking to the story itself, I'm with you. There are absolutely parts that I really, really appreciate. What's interesting is that what a lot of people don't pick up on is that is actually supposed to be the end of the Silver Age Batman. Like, that story was coming out right around the time of Crisis on Infinite Earths, when we were closing a huge chapter on DC's history. And we were going to be distancing ourselves from the version of Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman et al. That had existed before then. And we have Alan Moore, who does a story called Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow that kind of closes the Superman book on that time frame. And Dark Knight Returns is that for Batman. And it's, from that perspective, absolutely fascinating, honestly. It predates the loss of Jason Todd, and yet Jason Todd is the reason that Bruce Wayne retires as Batman. Like, he can't handle it after he loses a Robin. That's not how it went in the main story once they introduced Jason Todd's death, which is also kind of interesting. But I like this idea of like something in his family being too much for Bruce Wayne to continue, but then also Gotham gets to a point that he comes out of retirement. There is some playing around at the beginning with how he has to do it differently now that he's an older guy, he's middle-aged. There's a lot of really interesting stuff in there. There's also one of my personal favorite panels that I will trot out even now, even with my Frank Miller issues, which we're going to get to, because listeners, I'm going to warn you off this book if you haven't read it, honestly. But there's one panel that I use constantly, and it's a picture of Batman snapping a shotgun in half, like just breaking it in his hands and saying, "These are the weapons of the enemy. They are cowards. We do not use them." And I'm like, yeah, man. Yes. It's great. So there are a lot of really good, iconic things going on in Dark Knight Returns. That said, Frank Miller is a trash fire of a human being. He is literal human garbage. Do not pay attention to him. He is sexist and misogynist and bigoted and racist, and he has been for his entire life, as near as I can tell, and he just hit it better / I wasn't paying as close attention because I was a child. So if you have never read Dark Knight Returns, I don't recommend it. I really don't, because I don't want Frank Miller to have any more money. Honestly, don't do it. Pirate it. I'll say it. Pirate it. I don't care if you must read it. Make sure you do it for free and in a way that does not get Frank Miller paid.
Oh, you're going a while further than me, because I would still really recommend the book. But again, it's not for the reasons I think a lot of people recommend the book, though, because I think it is an interesting historical look at Batman. And also, if you want to break down kind of like what the theme of this episode is in a lot of ways, like different versions of Batman and what that looks like. I think this is a really compelling and complex take. Also, did I mention the Batman in this story is a fascist? Like, straight up? Yeah.
Well, that's really sort of, right? I mean, okay. Obviously, there are fascist tendencies. You're 100% right. But it's a really liminal space where we're kind of putting that fascism more on the label. Like, there is a group of people, boy, we are getting into some like freshman film school level stuff here, but there is a certain school of thought that's basically like superheroes are inherently fascist as a concept. And I don't agree with that. I do think you can get them there, absolutely. But I don't think that it's inherently baked in. And Frank Miller is flirting with that in Dark Knight Returns.
No, Joshua, here's the thing. I don't think Batman in general is a fascist. I think this specific version of Batman is teetering really close into fascism.
Yes. Yeah, no. Miller is definitely flirting with it. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't buy into the idea necessarily that all superheroes are fascist. But in this scenario where I am the law sort of thing, I mean, again, this is 80s post-RoboCop. You can see it, the influence in the work. Like, this guy is very much like, I make the rules and play by them. But at the same time, we also get into the Batman. This is a whole other podcast, because there is the Batman versus the Superman thing where he is the law and yet he goes up against Superman, who is a tool of the government.
Right. It's nuanced, right? Yes.
So anyway, I do recommend it, but I also don't recommend it as this is one of the best versions of Batman. No, I'm like, it is a version of Batman that is really putting him in a sociopolitical context in a lot of different scenarios throughout the book that I find compelling and interesting to talk about. Not because I think he's a BAMF, B-A-M-F. You guys know what I'm talking about. Though he does some cool stuff like, snap a shotgun in half. That's pretty cool.
So I think I'm going to be real here, and I'm going to say I agree with you. I think it's a really interesting work. I think it's useful as a historical touchstone. The main reason that there are two main reasons that I don't recommend it. And one of them is Frank Miller, because honestly, go away, Frank Miller. The second reason is I only want it read historically, if that makes sense. Yes. It's been more than 3 decades. There have been better and more important Batman stories since then. And if there have been. But if there hadn't been, we should all be ashamed of ourselves. It's been at least 30 years. Do better. And so, when it's always on the top 10 lists, I'm like, that's not true anymore. I don't agree with that anymore. And part of that is because it's dating itself. And part of that is because Miller's gross, and the more subtle grossness is not subtle anymore because we know more about him.
Well, and this is just one of those, Josh. I just think that for Gen Xers, this is going to be one of the foundational Batman works for them. So it's always going to be a top 10.
For better or for worse.
As long as Gen Xers are the ones making the lists. And I should say millennials too. I mean, obviously my generation, we came after, that book came out before I was born. So, but it is still, because of that level of impact I think it had on the previous generation, Generation X, it is the one that's constantly recommended. Hey, I want to get into Batman. What are the ones you read? Oh, you read Year One, you read Dark Knight Returns, you read The Long Halloween. It's like one of those where it's like, it's the top because it's the one everyone reads really early on. And again, to your point, I agree with you. Why is that one of the ones that people constantly get recommended? Because I don't think it's the best version of Batman. I do think it's really interesting, and should be taken in a historical context. I think it's worth keeping on your shelf.
Now, that said, they nail the homage. I kind of retroactively wish they hadn't done it, but they did it and it made sense at the time, and they nail it. They absolutely get the tone. They absolutely get the feel of it. Michael Ironsides as Batman is a perfect casting for that.
Perfect.
I still really have a little soft spot in my heart for Carrie Kelly as the first female Robin. Yeah, they nail the homage. I just kind of wish we could not do it.
Right. Well, and again, this was 1998, so they were a lot closer to The Dark Knight Returns than we are today. So I understand. It was probably the biggest comic book hit of a decade,
Oh, no, 100%. 100%. Yeah.
But we did get, I do like how they closed the anthology, so to speak, by shifting back to reality, so to speak. Where we have Firefly confront and Batman duking it out. I thought it was kind of a nice way to put a pin in it, so the kids actually get to see Batman in action. And yet, even though they see him in action, they walk away still not fully understanding who is Batman.
Right. And what I really enjoy about that kind of what you're calling Vignette 3, the reality here in our notes, which is great. What I like about that is you actually see bits and bobs of their other visions in him here, right? He comes swooping in and he's scary and not exactly monstrous, but that's because we know stuff the kids don't know. He is just clearly a really hardcore, he does a lot of, as you say, BAMF things in this fight with Firefly. So you've got a little bit of that DKR stuff. And he also makes jokes and puns while he beats Firefly up. So you even get a little bit of that Dick Sprang era. It's all on display here without really hanging a lampshade on any of it, which that's good. I like that a lot myself.
Right, absolutely. It just feels like a really appropriate way to put a pin on the episode, is to say, all right, they've all heard the stories, and guess what? They're all true. But they're all
right.
They're all not 100% accurate, but they're also all true.
Absolutely. And in the process, we get to see a lot of the stuff that I most appreciate about Batman. I mean, this episode starts with the kids loving Batman, even if he's a monster or even if he's a person who will snap limbs in a junkyard. They still love him, which feels so real life. Right? I mean, that's literally what we were just talking about. There was a time when I would just say, can we move beyond Dark Knight Returns? Because I was tired of talking about it, but I hadn't yet realized that there were some seedier things going on underneath it. So I hadn't disavowed it, but I was like, can we talk about something else? And yet there were all of these people who were just like Carrie in the story, who were like, no, it's the best thing ever. what an unexpectedly delightful bow to be tied on this episode.
Right. And I think as as we are beginning to really move towards the conclusion of the new Batman adventures, I'm really glad they included this, as a part of the body of work, because again, there's that metatextual, it's a celebration of Batman and all the unique things that make Batman different. They were able to experiment with the art directions. And ultimately, I just think it's if this is, I would say, The Legends of the Dark Knight is one of those episodes I would include on a recommendation list for sure. I wouldn't say it's the best episode, but it's just a love letter to all the different things that make Batman Batman, and feels really unique, and sort of the ideas they're throwing out there feel pretty true to this day.
Absolutely. Yeah. Sometimes for better and sometimes for worse, right? I mean, with a little mixed bag of Batman stuff in there that we're still sifting through on the silver screen in the last, 5 years. All right, Caleb, let's assume that everybody just really enjoyed Legends of the Dark Knight as much as we did, because why wouldn't you? And if that's the case, what else should people be reading, watching, playing, or experiencing?
Okay, I actually have 3 different things today. So number one, I'll actually start with this one. And I think I might have checked this out after you recommended it to me years ago. And it's a book called The Caped Crusader, Batman and the Rise of Nerd Culture by author Glenn Weldon. And it is, okay, so the core idea we threw out here is that all these kids have their own version of Batman, yet they're all true, but they're all sort of missing things. And this book goes really into the weeds about the history of Batman, how he's evolved over the decades, what he's meant to us as a culture, but also how different aspects have sort of cropped up at specific times. I've found it pretty compelling, especially when had the Batman versus Superman coming out and the sort of Zack Snyder Defenders coming out. Again, not that I have very complex feelings about all those films, but people who are doubling
mixed bag, right?
Mixed bag. People who are doubling down on it being like the definitive version and being like, whoa, let's just calm down, take a step back. It's okay that not everyone likes this version of Batman. And it's because the reality is there are many different versions of Batman. There's not one version of Batman. And I just feel like this novel is a really great sort of pairing with this specific episode if you want to read more into the history and why that has become truer and truer over the decades.
I really second that. That book is spectacular. And Glenn Weldon also has one about Superman that's really fantastic. He is an excellent pop cultural historian. You've probably heard him on NPR. Yeah, great book. I just really wanted to second that pick because I know a lot about Batman, and that book still aired out some of the rooms in my Batman memory palace.
Most definitely. If you want to see another really great example of an anthology episode where everyone has different stories about the titular character, I highly recommend Samurai Jack Season 1, Episode 13, Aku's Fairy Tales, where all these different, essentially Aku is trying to create propaganda painting Samurai Jack as the bad guy. So he gathers all the children in the major cities together and starts telling them stories, and then they start poking holes in it and saying, actually, no, he was more like this. So you see multiple different versions of Samurai Jack and his what he does to Aku, and they're all using different art styles from different kids' POV. I thought it was really clever. I'm confident. Obviously, I have not read any interviews confirming this, but I'm confident that Gennady Tartakovsky probably saw this episode and was like, how can we do this in Samurai Jack?
Yeah.
And anytime I can throw a Samurai Jack reference out there, I'll drop that. It's a great show. And then lastly...
Again, I concur.
Last one I want to say again is the idea of all these different versions of this character are true, but they're all different. And that leads me to my film recommendation, which is Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. I'm confident I've talked about it at some point on this podcast, but it's probably one of my favorite superhero movies of all time. And again, there are multiple versions of Spider-Man, and they're all really Spider-Man, and they mean different things to different people. So check it out. Joshua, what alternate media recommendations do you have?
I really like that Into the Spider-Verse recommendation. And I think that it would actually be really valuable to me in a conversation about how you can have a lot of different takes and still have a core to the character that doesn't shift. That maybe shifts a lot harder when it comes to Batman stuff. But I will save that for another time. That's not just a whole other podcast. That's like a whole thesis, I think. So Yeah, okay. I'm gonna do a couple of superhero recommendations here. I just feel like I have to. It's this one. And one of them is obvious. I tipped my hand already. I 100% think there's a straight line between the Dick Sprang vignette here and Batman the Brave and the Bold, which is my favorite Batman cartoon of all time. And I have really good objective explanations for why it's the literal best. Like, I can say BTAS is technically better, but overall, the Brave and the Bold is, I think, the best Batman cartoon we've ever had. And the reason for that is it really feels like those creators looked at the Dick Sprang, Carmine Infantino era and said, how do we make Batman this big and this over the top? But we honor the fact that he's kind of drifted as a character to be a little more taciturn and a little more serious, you know? And The Brave and the Bold really does this by taking a concept from the Brave and the Bold comic book, which was team up Batman with everybody. That was literally the point of that comic book for hundreds of issues, you know, is that they team him up with other heroes to either make him the mentor, fantastic choice, or the straight man. Right? He's serious. He's there to get a job done. But the Red Tornado also wants to learn what it means to be a person, like a human being. And Guy Gardner is just a giant personality defect. And the Blue Beetle is somewhere between hero worship and needs to be trained. It lets Batman be a more modern take of Batman while still also being the single most superhero take on Batman I have ever seen since Joel Schumacher, frankly. My other pick is a very specific X-Men story called Kitty's Fairy Tale. And what I love about Kitty's Fairy Tale, it's an early 80s Chris Claremont X-Men story, which is still really, I mean, there've been a lot of good X-Men stuff since then, but Chris Claremont, that era just remains the gold standard, and there's a reason. And it's because he would take an issue or two to just tell a completely different story based around Kitty Pryde telling Ileana, who was still a much younger child at this point, a bedtime story. And turning all of her friends, their friends really, in the X-Men into fairy tale characters in order to kind of tell this not true story that still gets to a lot of truth about their personalities and relationships. So those are my two picks. Watch all of Batman the Brave and the Bold cartoon on HBO Max. And if you can find a copy of Kitty's Fairy Tale someplace, get that thing read. That about wraps it up for this animated discussion. If you enjoyed this conversation and would like to join in, come find us on Twitter. Caleb is at CMastersTalk, and I'm at Joshua Unruh, and the hashtag is Animated Discussion. Caleb, where else can people find you?
Well, Joshua, I'm the editor-in-chief and contributor at the Cinematropolis, a website that specializes in in-depth film critique and analysis. We publish in-depth essays as well as our podcast, The Cinematic Schematic, covering all types of films. Most recently, The Suicide Squad with our very own Joshua Unruh. You can check it out, The Cinematic Schematic. You can find the podcast or those articles over at thecinematropolis.com.
Remember that an animated discussion is a Pulp Diction Productions program and is 100% supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can keep this and our other shows in production, check out patreon.com/Pulp Diction Productions. Show your support by pledging at Patreon or by leaving a great review on Apple Podcasts to make it easier for more people to find us and join in the discussion.
And of course, the links to Patreon, Apple Podcasts, our recommendations, and Twitter are all very easy to find in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining us for this animated discussion. We'll be back next time to talk about the Superman the Animated Series episode, Solar Power.
We'll see you back here. Same bat time, same bat channel.